Hey there, everyone. How you doing? I'm Lee Stranahan. Welcome to a special edition of Citizen Journalism School, sort of a live seminar. And let me explain what I'm going to do, but let me just first say who I am in case you stumbled into this. My name is Lee Stranahan. I'm a journalist and radio show host. I host a show called The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, which is Russian-funded media. And I'll talk about why I mentioned that in a second. But I've also been a journalist for about 13 years. I was the lead investigative reporter at Breitbart News. I used to write over at Huffington Post. And I am also the founder of something called Citizen Journalism School, citizenjournalismschool.com. And what I want to do, this is kind of, in a sense, a seminar in my head on how you can figure out what the hell's going on in a confusing news story that you're probably thousands of miles away from, right? I assume most people watching aren't in Ukraine or in Russia, and you're just watching this, and you're seeing all the reporting, and you're seeing a ton of stories all over CNN and Fox and everything else, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. So you don't have to be a journalist to get something out of this seminar. Because really, as a person trying to figure out the news, this is aimed at you as well. But if you're somebody who considers yourself something of a citizen journalist, or you want to be, and you want to write or do videos or do a podcast or something and try to analyze the situation from your perspective, hopefully some of the stuff I say is going to help you figure that out. So, I'm going to deal with this from a fairly high 50,000-foot level without getting into a huge amount of detail on this. You can do that yourself. But the way I'm approaching this is that I want you to think about just some broad ideas here. So, here's the situation. I'm recording this on the weekend, Saturday, 3-4 days after Russia launched its full-on military assault to demilitarize, they say, Ukraine. And so we're kind of right in the middle of that. And it can be confusing. And one of the reasons it's confusing is it's a war. And so, therefore, there's lots of spin and propaganda. And it's probably safe to assume there's going to be a fair degree of spin and propaganda on both sides. That would be the only thing that's logical to assume. It would be illogical to go into it, well, one side's going to just lie and one side's going to always tell the truth. So you're seeing some things, and a perfect example of this is the New York Post ran a story the other day that said a Russian tank had run over a civilian car. Now, it turns out that other angles came out. It looks like it was an accident, but furthermore, it looks like it wasn't a Russian tank. It looks like a Ukrainian vehicle. And that's an example of the kind of thing. And so the headline, Ukrainian vehicle accidentally runs over civilian, is not a good headline. So the other third agenda here, aside from whatever bias you need to assume Ukraine and Russia, the two players right now in this, are going to have, there's a third bias of the media. And of course, the U.S. media, some of them have a United States bias. But the Post, what I'm trying to get at is that one of their biases is they're trying to sell newspapers or get you to click on their story. And so if it's more horrible seeming, that's another bias to build in, is that the media is trying to get eyeballs. Does that make sense? So you need to think about all of those biases. But what I want to do is at a 50,000-foot level, ask some questions about how we can determine whether one side is right or wrong. I've said on my Twitter feed, and I've been saying it for days, that I stand with Russia, by which I mean I think Russia is right in this conflict. And I'll explain why a little bit. But I want to, before I get into the specifics of that, explain how can we determine whether one side is right or wrong. And the assumption I'm going to start by making is that you're not a pacifist. You can be anti-war. I'm anti-war, but I'm not a pacifist. Because if you're a complete pacifist, a Quaker or something, nothing, be whatever you want to be. But I'm just saying, if you don't believe that in any circumstances the use of force is correct, ever, then clearly what Russia did is nothing you're going to agree with because you're against the use of force. Most people aren't pacifists, though. And even people who are anti-war would agree, for instance, that if there's... And so let's talk about, after we're past that hurdle of you're not a pacifist, I think there are two primary ways, and maybe there's more and I haven't thought of them yet. It's possible. But I'm going to analyze two different ways to analyze whether a war is, whether military action, in this case Russia's military action, is justified. One of them is by looking at the motives. Why did they go to war? What was the reason they went to war? And I'm going to look at that further and show you a framework that you can use to determine. The cynical amongst you, and I'm sure there's a couple, might say, well, we have no way of knowing what their motives are. We can't read people's minds. Yeah, that's true. And I'm going to show you that there's actually a method you can apply to start to figure out people's motives. And we'll look at that method in just a second. But the other thing, aside from motives, is execution. In other words, how are they conducting themselves in the war? Right? And I think in both motives that we can tell and execution, Russia is correct. And I'm not going to make that case too much. I'd rather talk about how you can figure out the case, and then you can look at things on your own. Again, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm sort of here to help you maybe think about stuff with a little more clarity. So let's talk about motives first. Some people would say, the cynical amongst you might say, well, we have no way of knowing motives. Or you might say, well, people are going to lie about that. So Putin's going to say he's doing it for this reason, but he's not. And we'll deal with that argument in a second. But let me talk about how we can figure it out. First off, the first thing to do from an analytical framework is to figure out what the sides are saying. And don't do this objectively. I mean, don't do this subjectively. Just do it objectively. In other words, don't try to judge whether what the sides are saying is true or false. The first step is to try to understand literally what they're saying. So, for instance, Putin is saying he wants to denazify Ukraine. And we can tell that because he said it in a speech. Now, I'm not right now saying it's true or false. We can't determine that, and that's not our job yet. We'll come to that in a second, because there is a way to determine it, I think. But the first step is to understand what they're saying. So compare the claims. What Russia's saying, what Ukraine, the U.S. is saying. At a journalistic level, we have Vladimir Putin's statements, and a lot of the media says what they think Vladimir Putin wants, but they're not basing it on things that he said. They're basing it on their view of him. They're ignoring what he said. So if Vladimir Putin says he's trying to denazify the regime in Kiev, and if he's saying that this is about 8 years of attacks by the Nazi Ukrainian regime in the Donbas region, the eastern region of Ukraine, is that what he's saying? And the first way to check that is speeches. He's saying this. Now, what's interesting in this case particularly is that when the sides say, no, Putin's not doing it for that reason, they can't point to anything he said. They can only point to what they believe, and they're kind of making that up themselves. In other words, you'll see a lot of news stories that say Vladimir Putin's he's power hungry. He wants to put the Soviet Union back together. Now, there's nothing in the text where, in other words, Vladimir Putin's speeches, he's not saying, I'm trying to put the Soviet Union back together. In fact, if you read his speeches, and that's the first thing you should do on either side, is try to get original source material. If he made a speech, look at the speech. Don't look at what people are telling you about the speech. Anybody, including me, anybody, look at the speech itself. Look at the text. So, how do we determine whether Vladimir Putin... he says he's trying to denazify it. Then I've gotten into this with some people on Twitter. They go, that's not his real motivation. He's no angel. Well, that's not an argument. That he's no angel is not an argument, by the way. It's a statement of bias, actually. He doesn't need to be. We're trying to determine whether his stated motivation is true or not. And we have a way we can do that without reading his mind, because no one can. The first thing we can do is see if the statements he's making could be true. Let me give an example. On the denazification thing, is he possibly correct that there's a Nazi regime in Ukraine? That's the analysis you'd have to do. Or is it just something he's made up? Because if it's just something he made up, if there's no justification at all for it being a Nazi regime, then he's lying. Does that make sense? Think about it. If you did some research and you found out, no, there's nothing to do. Ukrainians, they hate the Nazis. And the Banderites he's talking about, they hate the Nazis. Then you'd go, well, that's not true, obviously. But if there's some basis for it, then you can't just reject his claim out of hand and go, well, he was lying about that. So I'm not saying it proves it. I'm saying it proves it's possibly true. Does that make sense? Please try to understand the distinction here, because it's important. I'm not saying you go, it's possible, therefore it's true. It's possible, therefore it's not false. That's a better formulation of that. In the case of Ukraine and the Nazis, and the Banderites in particular, it's not hard at all to research and find that, in fact, there's a ton of stories out there, not just from Russian media sources, but from Vice and Time and the Village Voice and so on, that show, in fact, there's a long history of these Banderites. They were Nazi collaborators, and that in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the Donbas region, there are groups like Right Sector and the Azov Battalion who are clearly Nazi influenced. You'll see pictures of them. The pictures themselves don't prove anything, but again, it definitely proves that it came from somewhere. And if people then try to go, well, that doesn't prove that they're Nazis. Don't forget, I'm not trying to do that at this point. What I'm trying to prove is that there's some factual basis, that Putin's not simply making something up. Because that's the first way to, without reading his mind, is it possible that he's telling the truth? And I think if you look through Putin's claims and you do the research yourself, you'll find that, in fact, there's some basis for what he's saying. Now, whether he's correct or not, that's a longer discussion, and I don't want to get into that, but I'm just saying that what we're looking at is it's possible. So that takes care of motive. The second thing I said is execution. If you look at his speeches, one of the things that Putin has said is that he's not going after military targets. He's only going after military targets, the opposite of what I just mistakenly said. Hang on. Caffeine. So what you want to look into is what his statements are. What are his words? He said he's going after military targets, not civilian targets. And so far, there's no proof that he's gone after civilian targets. There is some proof that Zelensky, the head of Ukraine, is putting weapons in military. They call it human shields in the Middle East, right? There's some evidence that Zelensky's doing that. And we know for sure, because it's admitted by their side, that they've handed out tens, thousands of Kalashnikovs to citizens. And that's and that they're conscripting people into the military. So I see no evidence at all as pointing to the fact that Putin was lying. And I consider execution, I'll put it like this. If the motive is good, in other words, let's say Putin's motive is, in fact, getting rid of Nazis who've been killing people for 8 years in Donbass, as he says, then I think that's a good motivation, personally. I think that's valid. I think that's war to stop war. You follow me? Now, again, if you're a pacifist, that won't fly with you. But I think by any standard, war to stop war is in a different category. Then when we look at the execution, is he doing what he said he was doing? Because I think a war that's trying not to kill civilians, just trying to take out what he called demilitarizing, is about as good as war can get. Now, I'm not saying civilians haven't been killed or won't be killed. That's going to happen, and that's why war sucks. That's why I, like all sane people, am against war. But when we look at the motive and the execution, I think in both cases, the counter-argument seems to be people who just hate Vladimir Putin who want to say, no, he's lying about his motive and he's lying about the execution. But there's no proof that he's lying about the execution because we know that the Russian jets took out the Ukrainian Air Force in about an hour and a half. And there's a great video I recently retweeted that there's a woman on Twitter, Dagny Taggart is the name she uses, like the character from the Ayn Rand novel Atlas Shrugged. And she's Ukrainian, and she's got family in the Donbass. And she reposted and sent a great video. And it was a guy who's in Kyiv right now. He's in Kiev right now. He's an American. And he's saying they're not taking out, he's in a hotel, and I was watching him. He's on the internet. So they still have internet, they still have power. And he talked about all of that. And I think that's the best way to, if you're going to have a war, not going after civilian infrastructure, to me, is good. Especially when you've got the capability. It's not like he ran out of planes or ran out of ammo or they couldn't find it. If Vladimir Putin had wanted to take out the power grid, easily the Air Force from Russia could have done that. And to me, it means something that he didn't. Now, again, whether you think it does or not, I'm not here to tell you what you think. I'm here to tell you the way I look at it by looking at the motive and the execution, and by looking at what he said and what he seems to be doing from the best available evidence. There we go. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Anyway, please do me a favor. Follow me on Twitter. If you want to be part of Citizen Journalism School, you can sign up over there. And we have a new program coming pretty soon. We may have a program on Ukraine and Russia in general. But if you have any questions, I talk to people. Don't be a dick to me because I don't like that. So if you come to me like a jerk, I'll probably make fun of your mother, your slutty mother. That's probably what I'll do. Just, that's a hint. And the reason I do that is because if someone's only argument is ad hominem, an insult towards me, you're going to get it back. And I can get a little salty, and I've got a dirty mind. So I can figure out all sorts of ways to use your mom, theoretically. And it may involve the truck convoy, I'm just saying. But don't be a jerk, or you're going to get some of that and more, and it'll be specific, and possibly involving some of the many pictures of your mom. I'm just saying, if someone says jerk, not you, you're nice. But the person behind you, that jerk over there, if you step up, comes correct. I'll just put it like that. But until then, if you got questions and you're not a jerk, please follow me on Twitter. If you have any questions, I try to answer them. And again, my goal is not to tell you how to think, not to tell you what to think. It's more to try to help you learn how to think better. So in this confusing time, you can make sense of it. Till next time, I'm Lee Stranahan. Love you guys. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.